Hey, how we doing tonight? We're going to get started here in just a minute. Hope everyone is doing well, and we're going to get going on our review that's going to cover 1800 to about 1848 tonight. Test tomorrow, just so you guys know, it's going to be about 28 multiple choice questions and one short answer. So same format as last time, just this time we have one more multiple choice question. So I don't see that as a major problem for you guys because you handled the last test quite well. Let me just get things set up here on my screen while we wait and see if anybody else wants to join in. Hopefully you guys have some questions tonight because I think I might be able to get through this pretty quick. So don't hesitate on throwing questions while I'm talking. Don't hesitate to answer questions while I'm talking. I mean, that's the best part of the live chat is you guys can share back and forth. And I guess I got about 13 of you watching now, so it's about 7:38. So I'm going to go ahead and get started just for the interest of time so we're not here all night. Like I said, we're covering basically what's known as the Jeffersonian era through the 1840s, the end of the Jacksonian period. And what we're looking at is we'll be looking at the presidencies of the Virginia dynasty, which is Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. We'll talk briefly about John Quincy Adams, most importantly about the corrupt bargain, and then we're going to get into the Jacksonian era. Like I said, if you have any questions as we go, just don't hesitate to shoot them out there. But if we're ready to go, I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. And just like normal, I'll talk my way through it. And if you guys have any questions at any point, shoot them out there. So anyway, like I said, we're talking Jefferson through actually through Harrison, but we're focusing on Jefferson through Jackson. And we know that Thomas Jefferson, we know him from the last test just because he came in and wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the first vice president, or actually he was the first Secretary of State, and then he'll come in as vice president to John Adams. And in 1800, what we call the election of 1800, Jefferson is going to take the presidency. Now, we call it the election of 1800 due to the fact that when this is the first time really in history that we see a peaceful transition of power between two parties. We're going to go from the Federalist Party to the Jeffersonian Republicans. And Jefferson's going to come in after quite a turmoil in the House of Representatives, because if you remember correctly, what happened was that there was a tie. John Adams was at the bottom of the list, but there was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Jefferson's going to win, I believe, on the 36th vote in the House, and part of that had to do with Alexander Hamilton kind of swaying his view behind, or his support behind Thomas Jefferson, among others. I mean, Hamilton contributed, but he was not the sole figure who led to that. Now, Jefferson's first term was seen as quite a success. He is going to be dealing with the war in Tripoli, and that was the war with the Barbary pirates. And if you remember correctly, the Barbary pirates were coming from the countries of Morocco, Algeria, and Tripoli. And these are pirates that had been paid tribute over the years not to interfere with trading in the Mediterranean Sea. Well, when Thomas Jefferson comes into office, what we find is that the Tripoli pirates want more money. And in seeking more money, they're going to actually end up declaring war on the United States, and we're going to be fighting in a naval war over there. This tribute had been paid for some time by the Federalist presidents, including George Washington and John Adams. 4 years we fought for this, fought in this war, and if you remember, we talked about it in class. After the 4th year, we negotiated a tentative peace, and there's still going to be some conflict with the pirates until about 1815, when Commodore Decatur is actually going to create, a long-term lasting peace. So that's kind of the foreign policy that Jefferson is going to have to deal with right off the bat. A couple things you might want to think about is just, I don't want to get too in depth with the Barbary Pirate Wars. I think they're interesting to study. They're by no means the most important part of Jefferson's presidency. The one thing that is going on while Jefferson is president is we're going to have the establishment of the Marshall Court. John Marshall was one of John Adams' midnight appointments. He is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the first things he's going to have to look at is, what happened when Adams tried to extend the Judiciary Act of 1801 and try to stack the courts with a bunch of Federalist judges. We're going to look at basically what happened in the case of Marbury versus Madison, where Marbury is a judge who his appointment never got delivered. So he is going to sue James Madison and the federal government for a writ of mandamus. If you remember correctly, a writ of mandamus is basically a court order for a specific action to take place. And so Marbury is going to seek out that writ, looking to have Madison forced to give him his appointment to the Supreme Court. This case is going to be heard by John Marshall, and the decision is going to be that portions of the Judiciary Act of 1791 that was created under Washington are going to be determined to be unconstitutional. For that reason, Marbury is not going to get his appointment, but the important thing that's going to come out of this case, and I told you guys this in class, anytime you see Marbury v. Madison in the courts, or in any question or anything, what you're looking at basically is judicial review. John Marshall created a power, in a sense, for the judicial branch, because if you look at the Constitution, it's Article 3 of the Constitution, it just states that the judicial power of the United States is vested in one Supreme Court. Well, the problem is that wasn't really expanded. The explanation was never really expanded on. So what John Marshall did in his actions in declaring portions of the Judiciary Act of 1780 or 1791 unconstitutional is he's taking that first step to determine that the court's main power is judicial review. And just a quick definition, judicial review determines the constitutionality of laws. We're going to hold up these laws to the Constitution, and if they, hold muster and they do follow what the Constitution says, they're determined constitutional. But if they don't, if there's parts that don't align with the Constitution, then the Supreme Court has the power to declare those laws unconstitutional. Now, Congress does have the authority. They want to go back and look at these unconstitutional laws to rewrite them, to resubmit them, and they can do that. But generally, when a law is declared unconstitutional, it has to be completely changed before it's put back on the books. Now, some other key court cases that are going to come up under Marbury, number one is going to be McCulloch versus Maryland. That dealt with the bank in Maryland and the state of Maryland trying to tax the federal bank. And Marbury's going to rule in this one that basically it's the supremacy of the Constitution, that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and states cannot pass laws that supersede the Constitution. So when you see, just review, Marbury versus Madison is judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland is going to be the supremacy of the Supreme Court. McCulloch also deals with the idea of the elastic clause, because if you remember correctly, Hamilton created this bank under that necessary and proper clause of the U.S. Constitution that's right at the end of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And basically the Federalists, when they look at the necessary and proper clause, they look at the part of that clause that says it's proper, what's proper for the United States. And they say, it's that gray area or that loose interpretation of the Constitution that has allowed the bank to actually be created. McCulloch versus Maryland is going to reinforce that interpretation. The other case you need to be familiar with is Gibbons v. Ogden. Now, Gibbons v. Ogden was the case of two competing steamship or two competing shipping companies between New Jersey and New York. And what Gibbons v. Ogden is going to give us is reinforcement of the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution. And that's the one that determines that it's the U.S. government or the Congress that regulates interstate commerce, the trade between the states. So again, Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. McCulloch v. Maryland is the supremacy of the Constitution, and Gibbons v. Ogden is going to be the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So that's all going on during Jefferson's first term. A couple other cases, that are in your review packet. Dartmouth College, that had to deal with basically keeping government out of private schools. So you Fletcher versus Peck, that had to do with the Yazoo land claim down in Georgia. So those are other cases that you need to be familiar with. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. We talked about in class or in your book, so if you want to check those out, you might want to look at those. It was Dartmouth College versus Woodward, I believe. So, all right, so that's the first term. And then Jefferson's first term is honestly going to be highlighted by the purchase of Louisiana. And what's going to happen there is we're going to see Napoleon is going to regain control of Louisiana. They take it back from Spain, and there's concern that France might try to reassert its power in North America now that it's under Napoleon. So what Jefferson's going to do is he is going to send a couple men, Robert Livingston and then later James Monroe, over to France to negotiate with Napoleon to try to at least get the port of New Orleans and maybe the western part of Florida and stuff, from Spain, and they're going to try to negotiate that. Now, what's going to happen is Livingston's going to go over first, and he will be followed by James Monroe. When James Monroe gets to France, he's found that Livingston is not only just negotiating the purchase of New Orleans and the Florida area, but more so, Napoleon's offering him the entire Louisiana territory for the cheap price of $15 million. Now, this is going to be interesting for Jefferson because Jefferson believes in that strict interpretation of the Constitution, as most Jefferson Republicans do. And so, does the Constitution, it gives him the power to negotiate treaties, but does it give him the power of the purse, or that means gives him the power to spend this money? And because it's such a good deal, they're going to jump on it. And when they come back to the United States, the Senate is going to quickly ratify this treaty between us and France that practically doubles the size of our country. This is going to lead to what the Lewis and Clark expedition, because as soon as we get control of that land, we're going to see Jefferson go ahead and commission the Corps of Discovery to go out and explore all this new land and really start searching for that Northwest Passage that has been elusive to everyone since the very beginning of exploration over here in North America. So that's like the first term of Jefferson, and things are looking really good, and he's having, quite, success with all of this and everything. It's going to be in the second term, though, that he's going to run into a lot of problems. You do have, at all of this time, Britain and France are at war over in Europe. And because of that war, England has put a blockade around Europe. They've started basically taking our ships or damaging our ships, impressing our sailors. And, we're starting to have some trouble with the Native Americans on the western frontier. Now, Britain had stopped impressing our sailors for a while, but then they started it back up again. And I think one of the big events that's going to, basically what's going to happen is England is going to keep impressing our sailors. So first we're going to take some legislative actions. Now we know that Great Britain changes their maritime policies. They change some of the rules, the way that, and they say they're going to stop all these ships if they think we're supplying Napoleon. What France was doing was trying to kind of use the United States as a shill to ship goods to their country during war from the French West Indies. So they bring their ships here. They transfer the French goods onto American ships, hoping that the American ships would be able to get through the blockade because they were a neutral country. Well, what Great Britain is going to do is they're going to pass, the Essex decision. And in the Essex decision, they're going to basically say, we're going to stop all ships heading to Europe because we fear that they are indeed going to supply our enemy, the French. So they'll start doing that. They're going to start impressing our sailors again. So Jefferson is dealing with this problem. And what's really going to kind of, get things heated up is going to be the Chesapeake Leopard affair, where the Leopard is going to attack the USS Chesapeake just really about a mile or two off the coast of Virginia. We're going to have 21 casualties. We're going to have sailors impressed. And, a lot of people in Congress are calling for Jefferson to declare war, but he refuses to. Now, those are the war hawks, and we talked a lot about them. And then also, Great Britain is going to issue what's called the Orders in Council. That's kind of a supplement to the Essex decision, and the Orders in Council is going to basically forbid all neutral trade with France and her allies. And that's us. I mean, that's who we are. We're the neutral trading partners of France. We're the neutral trading partners of England. And so this is going to cause a big problem. So Congress is going to respond in 1806 by passing the Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act said we're going to stop trading certain goods with Great Britain, hoping that we can, if we cut off certain supplies to Great Britain, they'll turn around and reopen the trade routes for us. That's not going to work. And in 1807, Jefferson is going to pass the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act, that's when we saw this, let me put this up here. You can see it on the right there. This cartoon comes out. Oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. This Embargo Act that's causing, embargo means we're not going to trade with anybody. We are shutting down trade with all bidders at this point. This is going to create havoc in our economy, especially for the northern colonies, the New England regions, because they depend on trade and they rely on trading with England, trading with France. They build the ships, they load the ships, they take all that stuff. And so when you cut off trade, you cut off their economic lifeline. This is going to go on for almost 2 years. The last act that Jefferson will post as the president is he is going to lift the Embargo Act, but by that point the damage is done. We try to fix things when Madison comes in, as in 1809. Madison will be our next president, and they're going to pass the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. And what that did is said, okay, we're not going to trade with England or France, but instead we'll trade with the rest of the world. The problem we have with that is the rest of the world, a lot of it's already colonized by England or France, so that cuts out a lot of them too. So what we're going to see is finally, I think we didn't really talk about it in class, but what's going to replace the Non-Intercourse Act is Macon's Bill number 2. And Macon's Bill number 2 is going to open trade with England and France. Initially, we said whoever comes to us first, that's who we'll trade with. France actually comes to us first, and we start trading with them right away. And then in response to that, England's going to go ahead and lift their Orders in Council as well. But by this point, for us, the damage economically is done. And when we get to this point, we're going to get to about 1812, and Congress will eventually declare war against Great Britain. Now, there's going to be several causes leading into the war. It's not just trade. Our economics and our trade is just one key part of it. One thing that we ran into was that we had some problems on the western frontier with the Native Americans. One Native American, Tecumseh, was trying to rally other tribes around him and get them involved in maybe pushing back English settlement or American settlement in the western frontier, which is what we call the Midwest, or actually the Mideast today. We're going to actually have the Battle of Tippecanoe, where we first meet William Henry Harrison. He is going to win that battle. Of course, Tecumseh and his men weren't there, but more importantly, what we discovered after the Battle of Tippecanoe was a lot of Canadian muskets. And the fact that these Native Americans in this Ohio River Valley have these Canadian muskets leads us to believe that the British were in fact supplying these weapons to the Native Americans, which makes us feel like they are trying to incite the Native Americans against us. So this is really going to be kind of what's going to lead to the War of 1812. We are going to declare war against Great Britain. The primary causes of the war is going to be the maritime rules of Great Britain, the impressment of our sailors, the Native American attacks, in the West, the blockade around in Europe, and the interference with our trade. These are the ideas that are going to lead to the war. And the problem is, going into this war, we weren't prepared for it. When Jefferson had become president, he cut the military in half because he didn't believe in having a standing army during peacetime. And so that's going to cause some problems. I'm sorry, guys. Someone just texted me. Let me answer this text real quick. Okay. Sorry about that. So we're not prepared. Jefferson had cut the military. We also have a lot of people in the United States who are against this war, specifically up in New England. They don't want to fight in this war. So we're going to go through a lot of different, hiccups in this war. We're going to try to invade Canada 3 different times. None of them are going to succeed. While Harrison had been successful in a couple different places, it really doesn't matter. I'm sorry. Someone's trying to get on, and I'm gonna try to let him get on. All right. So this is going to go on. Great Britain at the beginning of this war really isn't much of a threat because they're still fighting over the Napoleonic Wars. However, that's going to end in 1814. 1814, Great Britain is going to focus their forces here in North America. And they're going to come in here like 5 different points, but the biggest probably raid they have is the raid on Washington, D.C., where they are actually going to burn Washington, D.C., specifically the White House, parts of the Capitol, and other buildings. And we lose so much valuable historical information at this time. I mean, it just burned to the ground. All the stuff from the Constitutional Convention, the notes and everything like that. But fortunately for us, Dolly Madison, the wife of James Madison, is going to save some key historical memorabilia for us, that portrait of Washington that I told you about. She's also going to save a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And so that's fortunate for us. What's really fortunate for us as far as the attack on Washington was the rain, because a huge tropical depression or hurricane came through, and the rain actually prevented a lot of the buildings from being utterly destroyed. But the White House absolutely was destroyed. The next big thing you need to know about the War of 1812 is probably the battle at Fort McHenry. That's where Francis Scott Key is now. He's going to be there at the battle. He's going to be on a British ship in the bay, and he's going to be viewing the battle as it goes on. And at the end of the battle, as the dawn breaks the morning, he's going to see the flag flying over Fort McHenry, and this is when he's going to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So just be familiar with that it was, Francis Scott Key at the Battle of Fort McHenry. Now, when we get to about December of 1812, what we're going to see is that, 1814, we're going to have a lot of different things all occurring at once. And I haven't shared any of these slides with you. I'm so sorry about that. I'm just trying to do too many things. At the end of the War of 1812, we have three different events taking place. We have the Hartford Convention, we have the Treaty of Ghent, and we have the Battle of New Orleans. Now, the Hartford Convention is taking place, and this is the meeting of the Federalists up in Hartford, Connecticut. And what they're going to be doing is they're going to be trying to create amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And these amendments, we talked about those in class. They were asking for like 2/3 majorities for different additions to our Constitution. If we declare war, they wanted a 2/3 majority voted. If an embargo was passed, they want a 2/3 majority to pass it. If a new state wants to come into the Union, a 2/3 majority. And they also wanted to end the draft, or they didn't want to end the draft. They wanted to outlaw a draft or conscription of U.S. troops. Now, we haven't had a draft yet in our history, but there was talk of it during the War of 1812, just because you did have like places up in the New England area where they weren't willing to fight outside of their state. So that's why they brought that up. Now, while the Hartford Convention is going on, the Treaty of Ghent is being negotiated over in Europe. And the Treaty of Ghent is going to be the official end of the War of 1812. And we talked about the terms of that treaty, and the bottom line is we just said, let's all just go home. We're not going to trade land. We're not going to trade any funds or anything like that. England, you're going to get out of our western frontier, and everyone's just going to go home, and we're going to call it good. And so the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24th, 1814. Now, no one back in the country knows that this is going on because it takes time for stuff to get through. So the folks from the Federalists from the Hartford Convention, they're going to approach Congress presenting their ideas for these amendments, but they're going to put a condition on there. And they're going to say, accept these amendments kind of or else. And the or else turned out to be that they're possibly threatening that the New England states were going to secede from the Union. Well, about that time, while they're making these demands, another major event's going on down in New Orleans, and that's the Battle of New Orleans led by Andrew Jackson. Now, this happens, I think, the first week, I want to say January 8th of 1815, and basically what's happening is, not knowing the war is over, Jackson mounts a huge defense of the city of New Orleans and has a huge victory. The casualty numbers were... The English were in the thousands, while the Americans were less than 100. And so word spreads of this battle victory. I don't know why the word of this spread so quickly, but the word of the end of the war didn't. But the word of Jackson's victory spreads. And though we negotiated a, quote, tie in the war, what we ended up celebrating a victory in the war. And that big, huge victory was going to be Andrew Jackson down in New Orleans. So now when the Federalists come in and they say, hey, we have these demands for the U.S. Constitution, everyone's kind of like, hey, go pound rocks. We just won the war. We don't need to listen to you. And so what's going to end up happening is the Hartford Convention is kind of going to be the nail in the coffin to the Federalist Party, and we're going to see the Federalist Party just kind of fade away. I think in the election of 1812, it's going to be the election of 1812, Madison's second term. I think there's a Federalist that runs in that election and maybe one in 1816, but to no avail. They have no support whatsoever in the country. And so what's going to happen as we go towards the end of the War of 1812 and into Monroe's presidency, we're going to see the end of the Federalist Party and the end of the first two-party system in our country. Okay? Prior to the end of Madison's second term, we're going to see, man, I got way off on here. We're going to see a new system being introduced in our country, and that's going to be the American system. And the American system is going to be introduced by one Henry Clay. Sorry, I'm going to pull this up right here. Now, Henry Clay's American system is going to be put in place to build the economy of the United States. The idea is that it's going to, create an economic system that we can start growing on again, because we're still hurting from the Embargo Act of 1807. So when Henry Clay introduces this American system, it's going to have three parts. And I think I told you either remember NIP or remember BIT. The first part is rechartering the national bank. The bank's charter had run out in 1811. And the idea was we want to recharter that and get a national bank going to stabilize currency and stuff like that, and start paying off more debt. Now we have more war debt. And the next part is going to be infrastructure. As our country grows, we need better infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, stuff like that. And so that's going to be part two. And who that's really focused on is the western part of our country, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri here pretty soon. And then the final part is going to be a tariff, and it's going to be a protective tariff. And the idea behind that is a protective tariff is going to protect American manufacturing. Now, I mentioned to you guys before, the biggest effect of the War of 1812 is going to be America becoming self-sufficient. We're going to drift away from that idea of mercantilism because we lost that trading partner during the war. Now we got to start doing our own manufacturing. Well, the American system is going to be put in place to protect American manufacturing, not only protect it, but to spur it, to give growth to it. Because if we're putting tariffs on foreign-made goods, that means American-made goods will be purchased more readily, and that will boost American industry. So that's going to be the three part of the American system. Now, you are going to have some in government who are going to be fighting parts of that. The South, the tariff is terrifying to the South because they rely on trade. And because of that, that tariff is going to become reciprocated on them, retaliatory on them. If the United States is going to put a tariff on incoming foreign goods, more than likely these foreign countries are going to put a tariff on American goods going over there. That's what the South depends on. So they are going to fight against the tariff of the American system. Let me jump over here. That's going to take us into about the 1820s is where we're at right now. And in the 1820s, we are going into the presidency of James Monroe. Now, James Monroe was elected in 1816. He is going to be the third of the Virginia dynasty. Remember, the Virginia dynasty was composed of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and now James Monroe. And coming out of the war and everything like that, this is going to become known as the era of good feelings. We're obviously feeling like we had a huge victory in the war, and now we're going to start rebuilding our country, which is fantastic, and all this is going on. And so Monroe is going to oversee the era of good feelings. He is going to have his challenges, though, and that's going to be the fight over the American system. And a lot of different parts of the country are going to be questioning, how is Henry Clay's American system benefiting them? And we talked about this in class, and we talked about how really, the West is going to benefit from the infrastructure. The North is going to benefit from the tariff. The banks really don't have a lot of effect on anybody because they've established, you don't have, the South is not reinvesting or anything like that. They have their land. So they're really taking the hit from the American system. And this is when the argument's going to be that the American system, and this is what this cartoon represents, is that it's like everyone for themselves at the expense of your neighbor. And the neighbor in this case is going to be the southern states. And they are going to be feeling very left out by this and kind of victimized by the American system. Now, the one thing they're going to look at is possibly maybe we can build up, our power in government. And the way you can build up power in government is with more representation. And that's going to bring us to the Missouri question. And in the Missouri question, what we're going to see is Missouri wants to come into the Union as a slave state. Now, a lot of it had to do with the fact that, they had people moving into that territory already, and, they had slaves, so they just assumed they were going to become in as a slave state. The problem is, if you allow another slave state in, that could upset the balance between free states and slave states in the Congress. It's interesting because leading into the Missouri question, there were more free states, one more free state than slave states. And while Missouri is being debated as entering into as a slave state, Alabama also petitions for entry, and they come in without any fanfare, without any debate. A lot of it has to do with the geography of the United States. If you look at where Missouri is situated, which is right there, that orange state right there in the middle, it kind of falls in line with the Northwest Territory. And if you remember correctly, the Northwest Territory was governed by the Northwest Ordinance, which said that, there would be no slavery allowed in that new territory. And the majority of Missouri borders the Northwest Territory. So that's part of the argument there. Now, the first attempt at bringing Missouri as a state is going to come with what's called the Talmadge Amendment. And the Talmadge Amendment basically was set up to allow slavery to start with, but then it set up a system of gradual emancipation within the state of Missouri. And the way it was set up was once Missouri, the date of statehood for Missouri, once that hits, no additional slaves would be allowed into that state. And of the slaves who were living in the state at that period, any that were born after that date of statehood, they would be released from slavery at age 25. And so the idea was over several generations, we are going to see the end of slavery in the state of Missouri. And that was the Talmadge Amendment. Now that's going to pass the House of Representatives, but the Senate is going to say no. And that's when it's going to go to conference. And the conference is when members of the House and Senate come together and try to create a compromise. The compromise is going to come from our good friend Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is going to come in and he's going to introduce us to the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise is going to say, okay, the big thing is we need to maintain the balance of the states. And so what he did was first he went to Massachusetts and suggested that, if you remember we talked about that area up here, Maine was, and I'm using my pointer here, and you guys can't see my pointer, but Maine had additionally at one point been a part of Massachusetts. And while the Congress does not have the power to set up a state on their own, states can cede land to the federal government with the intent of them becoming a state. And so that's what's going to happen. Massachusetts is going to cede the territory we call Maine to the U.S. government. And so Clay recommends that Maine come in as a free state, and that Missouri comes in as a slave state. That way we're going to keep that balance between free and slave state. On top of that, to avoid future problems, we're going to set up a geographic line, and that line's going to be the 3630 line. And you can kind of see it here when you look up this a little closer here. The 3630 line runs right above the Arkansas Territory. And you can see in this map right there that all new territory below that line will be admitted as slave states, and all territory above that line will be admitted as free states. And so this apparently was going to be the Band-Aid on the problem. And that's all this is. This is a Band-Aid to a huge problem. But it does pass. Basically, you're going to see it's going to pass the House, it's going to pass the Senate, and it's going to be signed into law by James Monroe. Missouri and Maine are now part of the Union. Now, there's consequences that come from this. It's not just like everyone said, okay, we're good to go. Basically, the North is going to, they had kind of started expressing concern with the moral question of slavery. So now the South again feels under attack. I mean, they've already felt under attack from the American system. Now they feel under attack under their labor systems. And then, as we start to grow, as our country grows, which is going to take off here, and it's already kind of taken off, the South and the slave states are going to start fighting more in these new territories to allow slavery, or to at least allow the choice of slavery. So basically, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, honestly, you could look at that as the first big step towards the Civil War. And we're going to revisit that again as we go through the steps leading to the Civil War once we come back from break. The next thing I want to talk about in Monroe's presidency is probably going to be his foreign policy. His foreign policy, what he's probably best well known for is the Monroe Doctrine. And I don't have it on here, so let me go back to this slide here. I thought I had a slide. The Monroe Doctrine was when we took a role in the world with regards to protecting the Western Hemisphere from European colonization. Now, what was going on was you had, following the Napoleonic Wars, countries like Spain, Portugal, they were looking back towards Latin America. Now, while they had been fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, what had happened was a lot of Latin American countries had fought and gained their independence. And the concern is these European countries are going to want to come back over here and reclaim those colonies. And that concerns America just because that makes us possibly susceptible to foreign invasion or something like that from the south or the north, because we also have in the Northwest, Russia is starting to colonize up in modern-day Alaska. So James Monroe is going to have John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, draft what's become known as the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is going to set foreign policy for our country for the next 100, 200 years almost. I mean, we probably could still use it today if we needed to. And what the Monroe Doctrine said was we're not going to accept any more European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. And as long as the European powers agree to that, then what we'll find is that the United States promises to stay out of all European skirmishes and stuff. We won't come to your side of the world if you don't come to ours. And what we'll see happen is England is going to back us up here. England sees a great opportunity down in Latin America because as independent countries, they can trade with whoever they want. So England sees an economic advantage to supporting the Monroe Doctrine, because if other European countries come in and start recolonizing that area, they're going to lose that trade potential because those countries will enter into their own system of mercantilism. And that will be the end of that for Great Britain. So what we'll find is Great Britain will stand behind us. And really, this is kind of starting our continual alliance with Great Britain, like we still have it today. So, this is, kind of a big deal. And like I said, the Monroe Doctrine is going to govern our foreign policy all the way through the turn of the century, going into the 20th century. It's going to be the reason that we use to go into the Spanish-American War, into the World War I, and somewhat into World War II. So the Monroe Doctrine is one of those very important foreign policy concepts that you do need to be familiar with. That's going to take us into the 1820s. 1820s is going to see us enter into what's known as the corrupt bargain. And that's going to be with the election of John Quincy Adams. Now, Adams is going to run in 1824 for president, and his primary competition in this election is going to be Andrew Jackson. And what's going to happen is these two men are going to not tie. Jackson's actually going to win the popular and the electoral vote, but neither one is enough for him to win because you have to have the majority, and he doesn't have 50% of either one. And so that's going to lead Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams into what's known as the corrupt bargain, in which Henry Clay vows to take the states that are supporting him from the House of Representatives and put them behind Adams, and in exchange, he'll get the office of Secretary of State. And we looked at how the trend of our early history was that you use the Secretary of State's position as a launching pad to the presidency. Well, this is just going to tick Andrew Jackson off, and he's going to go into basically absolute campaigning from that point on. And he will campaign for the presidency as soon as Quincy Adams takes office. We're also seeing a brand new generation entering into our government. We're no longer having any... James Monroe was the last of the founders who served in government, and so now we have the second generation coming in, who had been part of our children and stuff during the Revolution and stuff. The era of good feelings is going to continue. Technically, we're still under a single-party system with Jackson coming in. That's going to bring us into a new two-party system. Era of good feelings will come to an end as as Quincy Adams is facing a lot of economic crises during his presidency, a couple economic panics and stuff like that. Quincy Adams is not going to be able to get anything accomplished during his presidency whatsoever. And a lot of it has to do with Jackson and his scheming from behind the scenes, and stuff like that. So that's going to take us into the age of Jackson and what's known as the age of the common man. Now, before I get started on that, let me get back over here, and I want to give you guys the chance to ask any questions that you might have. I haven't seen anybody come on and ask any questions, so just let me catch my breath here before I go into the Jackson era, and then if you have any questions, go ahead and shoot them out now. So, okay, not seeing any, so I'm going to press on with the Jackson era because we got a lot to talk about there. If you have any, just again, go ahead and type them up, and we'll go ahead and go with them. Age of Jackson. Age of Jackson, honestly, is going to be a lot of controversy. I think I told you one thing that led to Jackson's election is the rise of the common man. Prior to Jackson becoming president, those 4 years that Quincy Adams was president, we see a lot of states changing their voting laws. And what's going to happen is they're taking away the property requirements to vote, and now all white men are going to be able to vote, and it's going to be called universal white male suffrage. Now, not all states are going to go right away. It's going to be a process, but we will see a huge rise in voting totals as we go from the election of 1824 to 1828, which was Jackson's first term, to 1832, his second term, to 1836, and by 1840, we're going to see the popular vote from 1824 to 1840 jump from about 350,000 votes to over 2 million votes in just that 16-year period, and that's the effect of the common man. We're also going to see the way that we vote for president change. It used to be that it was the state legislatures who would vote, and then they would send those votes they would take the votes of the people, but then they would vote, and they would send their votes to the electors, and the electors would vote in the Electoral College. Well, what's happened is under this new system, the state legislatures are being pulled out, and now it's the people voting, and their votes are given to the electors who represent them at the Electoral College. Basically, Jackson's going to come in. John Calhoun is going to be the vice president. Martin Van Buren will be nominated as Secretary of State. These are his cabinet members. But what Jackson also does, though, is he meets with his closest advisors. And that's going to be his kitchen cabinet. And these are friends that he relies on and everything. And they meet kind of on the side, and he looks for their advice and stuff for the decisions he's going to make. One thing I didn't talk about in class, and I mean, I don't think you need to know it for the test. It's just kind of interesting. The split between Jackson and Calhoun, it had to do with, yes, the Tariff of Abominations, but it also had to do a lot with what was known as the Peggy Eaton affair. Peggy Eaton was the wife of John C. Calhoun. And basically, you had a Secretary of War in Secretary of War. She was the daughter of the Secretary of War, and she had very humble beginnings. And what happened was that a lot of the cabinet members didn't really accept her. Just, she had been the victim of a lot of, they thought she was too humble to be, or she had too simple of beginnings to be, up there with the elite, so they kind of ignored her. Jackson's going to try to push for her to be accepted just because of what happened with his wife, Rachel, during the presidential campaign. It's not going to be until Van Buren finally recognizes Mrs. Eaton and says, all right, we'll bring you into the fold, that things finally start to calm down. But Calhoun was pretty upset of the way his wife was treated or the way he and his, I'm sorry, I messed it up. Jackson was upset with the way that Calhoun and his wife treated Peggy Eaton, who was the wife of the Secretary of War. And so that's going to cause some problems between Jackson and Calhoun before we get to the Tariff of Abominations. And that really, I'll be honest with you, has nothing to do with what's on the test or anything tomorrow. But I saw it here in my notes and I realized I hadn't mentioned that to you. So we'll just keep going. The tariff, I'm going to talk about the Tariff of Abominations last. We talked about the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears. We talked about Worcester versus Georgia, the fact that gold had been discovered in northern Georgia and now the Cherokee are being forced off their land. Worcester versus Georgia, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. These are two cases under John Marshall that support the Native Americans. However, Jackson refuses to enforce that ruling. In fact, he had already had a law passed in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act, which was going to remove the Native Americans to tribal land in present-day Oklahoma. This is going to result in the Trail of Tears, where we're going to see thousands of Native Americans die, relocated. We're going to see, different tribes being forced to assimilate with each other, so different cultures are being lost and stuff like that. And because of that, Jackson is still seen as a racist today because of his views of the Native Americans. Another big part of his presidency is going to be the fight over the National Bank. Now, the National Bank had been renewed under President Madison in 1816. It has a 20-year term on it. It's going to come up for renewal in 1836. However, they're going to try to renew it sooner during Jackson's presidency. He is actually going to veto the National Bank. He still believed that the National Bank was unconstitutional because, at this point we have two new parties in our country. We have the Whigs, who kind of fall in line with the ideas behind the Federalists, and we have the Democrats, who kind of fall in line with the Jeffersonian Republicans. There's a few little minor changes, but when we did those charts and we compared them, you could see that they were very similar, in fact. And Jackson still believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He doesn't believe the bank is the right thing to do. And remember, all Jackson wanted to do during his presidency was reduce the power of the federal government, and killing the bank definitely is going to reduce its power. So we see him shifting a lot of federal monies into state banks or his pet banks. He kills the bank. His biggest foe was Nicholas Biddle, who was the bank president. And Jackson famously said, the bank is trying to kill me, so I'm going to kill it first. And I guess he gets the last laugh because who's on our $20 bill today? I still just think that's ironic that it's Andrew Jackson who's on a federal note, when he despised the federal bank as much as he did. Finally, the biggest controversy of Jackson's presidency is going to be the Tariff of Abominations. Now, this was passed in 1828. I told you that it was the largest tariff in U.S. history. I think we looked it up and someone said it was 38% tax on all incoming goods. That is going to kill the Southern economy because they're paying that 38% when they take their goods to other foreign countries because of their, why can't I remember this word? They're basically reacting to our tariff by charging us a tariff as well. And so what's going to happen is John C. Calhoun, who is going to leave the vice presidency, is going to mount a charge for South Carolina to nullify the Tariff of Abominations. And through nullification, what they want to do is they're saying that South Carolina will not accept any or won't collect any tariffs within their state boundaries. They're basically saying we're going to ignore this law. We're not going to accept it as constitutional. And based on the writings of Thomas Jefferson and the Kentucky Resolution, we believe we're in a compact with the rest of the states, and we have the right to do that. And we believe it's the states' rights to interpret the Constitution. So they're going to nullify this. Now, Jackson has a choice to make. Does he stick to his states' rights philosophy, or does he side with the federal power and the bank? And as the president, he should side with the federal power because that's his job. But as the Democrat, as the strict constructionist, and the states' rights guy, it's going to be difficult for him to do that. But in the end, he is going to side with the federal government. He is going to get have Congress pass the Force Act, which is going to lead them to give Jackson the power to take a military down into South Carolina to force them to collect this tariff. Now, South Carolina is going to respond by building up their militia. And we have the real possibility of a face-off at the South Carolinian border between federal troops and South Carolinian militiamen. But enter once again our good great compromiser Henry Clay, and Henry Clay is going to come in and introduce the tariff compromise. And we laughed about it, but basically he said, why don't we just reduce the rate of the tariff, and that will everybody be happy with that? And in the end, South Carolina accepted the lower rate. They did nullify the Force Act, which was kind of funny, but the crisis was averted. But you can kind of see where our country is getting further and further divided by these different ideas and these different thoughts. Jackson's going to leave the presidency in 1836, 37, and Martin Van Buren, who was his Secretary of State and then was later appointed as his vice president, is going to come in. Unfortunately for Van Buren, what he's going to have to deal with is an economic crisis. You can put a lot of it maybe on the bank. You can put a lot of, we talked about all the different causes of this crisis, and basically it had to do with the specie. What was the result of Worcester versus Georgia and Cherokee Nation? Cherokee Nation versus Georgia determined that the Cherokee Nation was a domestic nation within a nation, and then Worcester versus Georgia determined that actually the Cherokee Nation was its own international power. And so in saying that, what they meant was it was the federal government's responsibility to negotiate with the Cherokee Nation, not the state of Georgia. And the state of Georgia had no authority in the idea of pushing them out of their state, because it was almost a foreign affairs type relationship that we had with the Cherokee Nation. So both of these rulings were in favor of the Cherokee being able to stay, but due to the Indian Removal Act, due to the fact that Jackson refused to enforce the decision of the court, the Cherokee were still moved from Georgia onto the reservations in Oklahoma. So I hope that answers your question. The next thing I was talking about the economic panics of 1837 and then also 1839. Both of these had to do with what was going on throughout our country. We had a currency shortage once again, and the banks were requiring hard currency to pay off debt. We had over speculation where men had bought land on credit because they thought they'd be able to sell it. Hannah, nothing. You don't need to know anything about that. As far as they were taking out loans to buy this land, and then the land is going to lose its value. And when it loses its value, they're not able to pay their loans back. With that, you're going to see a lot of businesses closing. You see the banks close. You see a lot of unemployment. And so this is what Martin Van Buren has to deal with is these economic crises. And really, these are things that he has basically inherited from the Jacksonian presidency. Not all Jackson's fault, mind you. I mean, Jackson did kill the bank and everything, but really, this was just a lot of things, kind of like the perfect storm of the economic cycle in our country. The Panic of 1819, Brianna, is very similar in the sense that we have we just came out of the war. We have a lot of debt, stuff like that. So we have some challenging problems. Unemployment's going to go up a little bit because we're still kind of dealing with the Embargo Act and stuff like that. So it's just kind of fallout from all of that. As far as a specific reason, I don't have one for you right now that you really need to know. It's just, it doesn't have the intensity of the Panic of 1837 and 1839, but basically I would just, you could use over-speculation as a cause of the Panic of 1819. You could use, again, the shortage of hard currency for the Panic of 1819. You have the bank battle hasn't started yet, but those are the kind of the key ideas behind that. But unfortunately, Monroe handled the Panic of 1819 very similar to the way that Van Buren's going to handle the panics of the 1837s, and that's by doing nothing. Remember, the Republicans were all about laissez-faire economics, meaning hands off, don't get involved. And that's exactly what Van Buren did as president. He didn't get involved with the economy. He expected the economy to correct itself. Well, it should be no surprise then that when Martin Van Buren runs for re-election against William Henry Harrison, he is going to lose that election, and Harrison's going to come in. Harrison's going to take over. He'll be president for about a month. A lot of it because he decides to stand out for an hour and a half in the cold and the freezing rain and give an inaugural address. He's going to get sick. He's going to end up dying. But what's interesting about Harrison is the way he ran his campaign. If you remember correctly, I told you he mirrored, or he took the playbook of Andrew Jackson and he just implemented it, but he implemented it on the Whig ticket. So instead of a Democrat running under Jackson's plan, it was a Whig running under Jackson's plan. Now, he had picked John Tyler as his running mate. John Tyler was what I call a Democrat in Whig's clothing. He was expected to kind of go along lines with the Whigs, but in truth, he was a Democrat. And so when William Henry Harrison passed away shortly after his election, Tyler's going to come in, and he is actually going to take over, the kind of the Democratic policies that Jackson had in place. And some of the different things he's going to deal with. I mean, Texas has been trying to come in as part of the Union. He's going to veto that, and there's going to be a conflict between Great Britain and the United States up along the Canadian border, the Aroostook War, and that has to do with the lumberjacks fighting for control of territory and stuff. That's going to result in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which is going to basically set the border for Canada in our northernmost area. You have some conflicts over in Oregon with Tyler. A lot of this stuff we're going to cover, pick up right when we get back from break. But that's pretty much it. We went through Tyler in class, and I think the test is going to go through Tyler. We got through it in an hour and 2 minutes, so that's not too bad. So I'll sit here with you for a few more minutes, see if you guys have any more questions. Make sure I don't have any more slides. No, that's going to be that. We're going to talk about that when we come back. So basically, that's kind of what I got for you. What questions can I answer? Here comes one. All right. The Utopian Society. No, the Utopian Societies, Morgan, you're not going to need to know until the next test. I didn't think I'd put those on the review sheet. If I did, you don't have to worry about it. Kimberly, I talked about the Panic of 1837 just a couple minutes ago. That was dealing with the bank failures that had to do with the crop failures, the overspeculation, the overextension of credit, had to do with the specie you have requiring hard currency. So there were 5 causes to the Panic of 1837, and we went over those in class. So check your notes. You should have most of that in there. That also ties in with the Panic of 1839. It just kind of extended what happened in 1837. All right, so what else? What else do you guys have? Got a few more minutes before we call it good. This actually went pretty well tonight, so just while I'm waiting for you guys to pop up any more questions for me, I'll just remind you, you're going to have 28 multiple choice questions tomorrow. You're also going to have 1 short answer, and just like always, we'll get started right away and get going. We're not at the end of the month tomorrow, so I'm not expecting any type of fire drills or anything like that, but nothing surprises me anymore, so just be prepared for anything. All right, I guess I need to get Flynn up here unless there's some more questions. And oh, wait, what do you need to know about the Rush-Bagot Treaty? Sam, just be familiar with it. The Rush-Bagot Treaty basically just set guidelines for naval armament up in the Great Lakes. It was between us and Great Britain.
Great Britain obviously has control of Canada, so we have our navies up there, and it just controls the weaponry of our ships up there. It was just there was nothing that really spurred it. It was just kind of a here we are, and let's just work on this together. So just be familiar with the name. I wouldn't go too in depth on it. So anything else? Because Flynn's itching to play fetch. All right, just another minute. There's actually, I don't know if you guys realize this. I don't know if I've told you this. There is a delay. I'm about, I'd say about 35, 40 seconds ahead of you. So what you're seeing is basically, you know, yeah, I guess it's to prevent me from saying any bad words so I don't bleep them out. Fletcher v. Peck, that's a good question, Ishan. That was the case that dealt with the Yazoo land claims down in Georgia and everything. And basically, I'm going to pull up my notes on it because I want to make sure I tell you exactly. Of course, I'm not. Fletcher v. Peck, there we go. Basically, it declared it unconstitutional for for businesses or anything to sue the federal government, I guess is what I want to say. But we had that land that was sold. If you remember correctly, we had the land speculation where the land was sold. The Georgia legislature sold land to this Yazoo land company, and they got kickbacks for it. And what's going to happen is when a new legislature comes in and they discover that this has happened, they void those land contracts. Well, they're going to basically, the Yazoo company is going to sue for that land because they did have an agreement. And what Fletcher v. Peck is going to say is that business contracts are going to be, you know, they will be upheld. You can't just void a business contract. You just can't cancel it. And basically, the Supreme Court does have the power to rule state legislative acts unconstitutional if they go up against the U.S. Constitution. So Fletcher v. Peck, kind of like Gibbons v. Ogden, like McCulloch versus Maryland and all, it's going to increase the power of the federal government and reiterate this idea that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Over speculation, Ramesia, is basically when investors go and they think they can buy, in this case it's going to be land. They're going to go buy land cheap because they think they're going to be able to turn around and sell it very quickly at a higher price. So a lot of times what speculators will do is they'll take out loans from banks, go buy lands or go buy stock at a cheap price, thinking that they can sell it like within a month or two at a much higher price. And then they'll be able to take the proceeds from that sale, pay off their debt at their loans at the bank, and then take a profit. Well, what happens with over speculation is too much land was bought up. And what happened was all these guys took out all these loans. They bought up all this land, but then there was no one left to buy the land they had. So the value of the land actually dropped. They weren't able to sell their land, and then what ends up happening is they can't pay their loans back. The banks foreclose on those notes, but the banks lose all that money. And when the banks start losing money, the banks start going out of business. So they're kind of connected, especially in the Panic of 1837. What do you need to know about the immigration of the Irish and Germans? Just here, basically, just know that when the Germans, just like what we saw in our quizzes, when the Germans came over, they came over with more skill, they came over with more material goods, so they're going to be seen almost as an asset coming into the United States, where the Irish are escaping, you know, their famines and stuff like that, and they're almost seen as the scourge of society. There was actually some Irish that went into slavery during this time period. It wasn't a large number, but you did have Irish sold into slavery to help pay their bills and everything. But the Irish were typically seen as the lowest part of society. So if you picture that pyramid of society, you know, the Irish are going to be right there near the bottom. So, okay. What other questions? Any other questions you guys have for me? Those are a couple good questions there we had. Hopefully I answered them for you. Again, if you want some detailed notes, always just go onto the website and look under my PowerPoints, and anything that has years on it that says like unit notes 1815 to 1848, that has my notes on it. So it's just nothing but reading material. The Black Hawk War, don't worry about that for this test. The Black Hawk War is a Native American war. That's good. There's a number of Native American wars that take place. I know Jackson had to deal with some problems with the Native Americans and stuff during his presidency and everything like that. We didn't really get into the Black Hawk War, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time for this test. Just we'll talk about it later, and I'll make sure you're familiar with it going into the AP exam and stuff like that. So just looking to see if there's anything I wanted to tell you about here. Yeah, there was also the Seminole War during this time. A lot of it had to do with the Native American removal during this time period, because that's what Jackson's working towards throughout his presidency. So if you want to, tie some stuff together, if you want to talk about it in your short answer, the Black Hawk War, the Seminole War, there's some wars with the Choctaws and the Creeks, the Chickasaw. All of those are conflicts that came out of Jackson's need or desire to remove the Native Americans and get them out of, the Midwest, what we consider the Midwest, and push them further west. So, all right, couple more minutes. See if we have anything else come up. I'm going to sit here in silence if I can. Okay. I think that looks like that's about it. Oh, I just got a text from someone asking about the Essex decision. Sorry. My mom was calling me. The Essex decision, I talked about that earlier. That's where England said that they were going to stop all neutral trade coming from the Americas, because they were afraid that what would happen would be that Great Britain would get, I'm sorry, not Great Britain, but that we were trying to prevent any neutral trade or any goods getting to France, and the Essex decision basically said they're going to stop all neutral trade, so they're going to stop any American ship or any neutral ship to prevent any goods from getting to France, who they were at war with at the time. And then, Caitlin, I just saw your other text with regards to McCulloch versus Maryland. Basically, McCulloch versus Maryland, if you remember correctly, that had to do with the bank in Maryland and the Maryland taxing the federal bank. And the Supreme Court under Marshall said that Maryland did not have that power, and that it actually declared the supremacy of the federal law and the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution. So it basically, McCulloch versus Maryland, at that point kind of declares the federal bank as constitutional. So that was the purpose of that. And just to remind you of the court cases, Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. McCulloch versus Maryland is constitutional supremacy. Gibbons versus Ogden is the power of the Commerce Clause to regulate interstate trade. Fletcher v. Peck was, again, constitutional supremacy and the power of the U.S. government over state governments, as far as they can declare state laws unconstitutional if they don't align with the Constitution. Dartmouth College v. Woodward basically kept the federal government out of private colleges. I'm trying to think if there's any others that you might need to know. Those are just some of the ones. The top three are Marbury v. Madison, Gibbons v. Ogden, and McCulloch versus Maryland. So, all right. Is that it? I'm going to say that's it, because I think it's about time for Flynn to get up here. My voice is getting tired, and I got to call my mom back. So anyway, all right, so let's get him up here to get you guys some luck for the test. And let me see if he'll jump up here. Come here, Flynn. Get over here. Come here. Oh, just come here. Come here. Sometimes he jumps in the chair. Sometimes he doesn't. Come on, get up here. Come on. He's not jumping up. I don't know. We'll get it. Don't worry. Don't give up, because I'm waiting to see if any more questions come up. Get up here. Come on, get up here. Get up here. Oh, there we go. There he is. There's Flynn wishing you good luck. Got the ball. Got the ball. So, yes, all right, so I'll throw it. All right, so we will see you guys tomorrow. I think you guys will do pretty well on the test. It's pretty straightforward. Again, 28 multiple choice questions, 1 short answer. Be prepared to get started as soon as you come in. Let's close out this 6 weeks strong. Now, this test won't go on this 6 weeks, but man, we're 2 days away now from our Thanksgiving break, so let's finish strong. All right, we will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great evening. Oh, wait, there's another message. Oh, you're welcome. All right, we'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.